Well, welcome back to our Old Testament Survey 2 class we're looking at the monarchy, the divided kingdom. This part we'll be looking at the kingdom, the part of Israel. This is lesson 4 in our semester. We look at our outline again. We can see here that last week we looked at the united kingdom when we had Saul and David and Solomon, and now we're starting to look at what happens now that the monarchy is being divided. The kingdom is divided. We have the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This time we'll be looking in lesson 4 at the kingdom of Israel. And before we get going too far into this, there's a couple of corrections that you're going to need to make to your text. On page 46 in the top of the page there, you'll see it says the two tribes of Jonah and Benjamin. It should be the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. On page 48 in the list of kings, it should be Zimri, not Zimmer. Just add an I to the Z-I-M-R. On pages 54 and 55, you'll want to add a Roman numeral 2 after Jeroboam, just to make the difference between Jeroboam, the original one when the kingdom was first divided, and Jeroboam the second that was later. And also on page 55, the second verse there, the quotation for it, should be Amos 5:4. Looks like the reference from the first verse was just copied down to the second one, but again, that one should be Amos chapter 5, verse 4. As usual, we're going to start off with a question. And a question for this week is, how are we to act in a society that's turning its back towards God? We just look at this. The connection we want to look through here is, Israel and the prophets and evangelism today. As we're joining in and looking at the connection, since we're studying also during this semester, Paul's teaching about evangelism. We've seen a lot of connections between what the prophets were doing at the old days and some of the things we'd be doing in evangelism. Just how does this work? How does it compare today to what the prophets were doing back in the time of the kingdoms of Israel, and how they were then bringing God's word and also reminding the people that they're not following what God's doing and reminding them of judgment? And how does that relate to what we're doing in our evangelism today? And what would happen if we did this and a revival became evident? We noticed that in the times of the prophets, that when the people would listen and there would be a revival, and we'll see this much more next week when we look at the kingdom of Judah, but when there is a revival, then good things happen. The judgment that was going to come is delayed. And we have seen this through the ages, actually, as different societies were very much following God, and then as they drifted away, and then there would be revivals, and then things would go for a while, but eventually then they would just all drift away, just like Israel and Judah did, and then it would look like they're not seeing the blessings that they once saw. Topics we'll be looking at the kings of Israel. We're looking at the prophets that served the kingdom of Israel, and we'll take a look into their eventual captivity. Going back to our timeline, we here have the usual one with the whole period that we're looking at during this course. We've gone through the period of theocracy. We've gone through the period now when the kingdom was united, and now we're into this section on monarchy. Zooming in a little bit just to where you can see a little bit more detail on the monarchy period. The main thing you might want to notice here is that it's very much intertwined when we're looking at especially the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. You have to kind of keep an eye out of what's going on and really pay attention to what they're talking about, because they intertwine. the two kingdoms. They'll say, during the whatever year of the king of Judah is when this person became king of Israel, and vice versa. So there's a lot of intertwining there. You'll just have to keep it sorted out in your own mind as you're trying to go through that. The texts for this particular lesson, we'll be looking at 1 Kings 11 through 22. We'll be looking at all of 2 Kings. We'll be looking at the book of Jonah and the book of Amos. Now we get to the point where now we're seeing the division. Solomon has died, and per the words of the prophet, the kingdom is being ripped from his family. As you recall, because of God's love for David, he did not rip the kingdom from Solomon, but he said he'll wait until Solomon dies and he'll rip it from his sons. So now we see the division is coming about. We see 10 tribes that will go to the northern kingdom known as Israel, and this will be ruled by Jeroboam. And then we have 2 tribes to the southern kingdom known as Judah. This is ruled by Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. Sometimes you might see only say one tribe, which is just the tribe of Judah. That's probably because Benjamin, which as you recall was the tribe that King Saul came from, it was somewhat divided between the two during the time. They were right on the border. A good portion went to Judah. There were some parts that were in the actual kingdom of Israel. And because of some disputes that were constantly going on between these two kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the border would switch occasionally, and various parts of Benjamin would go back and forth between the two. Now, if we continue looking at this, we notice that the same promise was given to Jeroboam as to David and Solomon, with the same requirements. And that promise was that if you will follow God's rules, follow him, make him your only God, that then your sons will continue to reign on the throne, in this case of Israel. Unfortunately, Jeroboam rejected God almost immediately. He made these golden calves, and he used non-Levite priests. He made these calves and set up this new serious system of worship and a new place of worship because he was afraid. He was afraid that if the people went back to Jerusalem, which was the traditional location to do their worship, that they would just then eventually just drift back and become part of the Rehoboam kingdom down in Judah. He went so far as to say that these golden calves he made were the ones that led them out of Egypt. And of course, because of this, Jeroboam established a pattern for all the kings of Israel following him, and that they were doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and increasing idol worship. Pretty much each king got a little bit worse as they went along. And if we look at this list of the kings, this is the one where you'll notice that there's a Zimmer instead of Zimri. But each of these kings pretty much did wrong in the eyes of the Lord. If we look down at Jehu, he actually did a little bit of good, and because of that, there was a little blessing put onto him that four of his descendants would continue to rule. One of those was King Jeroboam, who lived in a relative time of peace for the kingdom of Israel. And then Zechariah was the fourth and final in the promise to Jehu. Now, the other thing we look at this is there's quite a variance in the amount of time that the kings ruled, anywhere from as few as 7 days in Zimri's case, on up to like 41 years in Jeroboam II's. Quite a span there. Now we're going to start looking at the prophets of Israel. A couple of these that I wanted to bring in, they're not spelled out so much in your text, but I wanted to bring them in just to illustrate the shift that's going to be taking place in the roles of the prophets, and to show some of their methods. First we'll look at Ahijah. He prophesied the division of the kingdom. He's the one that came to Jeroboam, and this is one of the things where I want to talk about the methods, is as we were looking back in our initial overview, our high-level overview of this, we mentioned that there are a lot of different methods that the prophets used to get their message across other than just speaking words. And this is one of those cases where we start seeing some of that coming into effect, because Ahijah was the one that tore his robe into strips and then told Jeroboam to pick 10, symbolizing, of course, that he was going to get 10 of the tribes of Israel that will become part of that kingdom that he will have. And he also then prophesied the judgment on Jeroboam when Jeroboam rejected God. Now, Ahijah was very much along the lines of the prophet of the type of Samuel. Just did a lot of things that were very similar. And then we have Shemaiah, not very well mentioned in the books, but important in the fact that he was used by the Lord to tell Rehoboam not to invade Israel. As we got into this thing, there was this big dispute there. Of course, Rehoboam, he was Solomon's son. He was not happy that the kingdom was being divided, and he was bent on going up and attacking the northern kingdom in order to bring them back in. But God used Shemaiah to say, don't do that, basically because God's word had to be fulfilled, and that the kingdom was going to be divided. If we look at the prophets of Israel that were the ones that you hear about more often, it's Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, and Amos. Looking at the prophet Elijah first, he ministers during the reign of Kings Ahab and Ahaziah. Some of the things that he was known for during his time of prophecy was the prophecy of the drought, that 3-year drought that came about. This is a time when he was then told to go off to this little brook kind of hidden in the crevices of the hills and the mountains there, and then God arranged for a raven to bring him food during this time, and he had the little brook there that he could get water from. This drought, of course, was a warning and an early judgment, just saying, hey guys, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. This is the kind of thing that can happen. And then, of course, when it came about that God said, okay, the time for the drought is to end, then Elijah was the one that mentioned that, and that's where you have the whole story about him sending his servant to go look in the little, nothing, and then this little cloud, and he says, get ready, it's going to rain like crazy. The main one that you probably always hear about when you hear about Elijah is when he challenged the prophets of Baal, or Baal, or however various people pronounce them. This is the one where he just went to the king and said, hey, gather up all these prophets of this idol that you guys are worshiping. I'm going to challenge them to a contest. They set up the 2 altars of fire. They divided up the oxen, put them on there, and he says, okay, you guys go first. If you can get your God to call down fire, then we'll know that he's the true God. And so all these, hundreds of prophets of this idol went out, and they were dancing and singing and doing whatever, trying to get their idol to call down fire, and it wasn't happening. And you can almost imagine Elijah going, yep, anything happening, guys? Anything new? No. Well, maybe you guys ought to just, maybe you ought to yell a little louder. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe Baal's asleep there. Maybe you should just, get a little bit louder. So, of course, they did. Nothing happened again. They got to the point where they were so desperate to try to get their false god to call down fire that they were, cutting themselves and injuring themselves and doing all sorts of things. And finally, Elijah said, okay, enough's enough. You've had more than enough time. My turn. He says basically just a fairly simple prayer, after, of course, having the people throw a bunch of water on the altar just to make it even more dramatic, that you got all this soaked wood and even a puddle around the altar. Real simple prayer, calls up to God. Fire comes down, consumes the offering. And at that point, the people say, wow, Yahweh really is God. That really is God. Didn't last, of course, but for a moment there was actually some revival. The other thing, of course, is that he did raise someone from the dead, and he did the fourth telling to Ahab, talking about the evil that he was doing. And eventually Elijah was taken to heaven in a whirlwind. Now, one of the things that characterizes this, we see this fire from heaven. It was basically a show of power, God's power, that was being demonstrated through Elijah. And mostly it's a big contrast between the evil of Ahab and the power of God that is being demonstrated through God, through Elijah, like a lot of this, where the fire was coming down. There was even fire, the chariot of fire, when he was brought up in a whirlwind. Then we get to the point where we are passing the mantle from Elijah to Elisha. Interesting note, I think, on this passing of the mantle, said that the cloak that he was wearing, that Elijah was wearing, fell down as he was taken away in the chariot, and then Elisha picked it up. Interesting that this cloak, the way it was described, one time they described Elijah as a hairy man. I think most people think it's not that he was, personally had a lot of hair, but it was because of this cloak, which was, they believe, made out of camel hair. And it's very similar to the outfit that John the Baptist was described as wearing. The other thing about this was that when Elijah and Elisha were going to the point where this being taken up into heaven was going to occur, they had to divide the river. And Elijah took the cloak and smacked it on the water, and it divided. And then after Elijah was taken up into heaven, Elisha did the same thing to go back to the other side, where he then smacked the water with that same cloak, and the river divided. This also, I think, was a way that God was using to just show, okay, the mantle has now passed. Elijah is gone. Elisha is now my main prophet here. Because there were 50, you might call them minor prophets, that were around at the time. You might call them more like worship leaders. They did they were worshiping with music. And they were there, and the idea was that now they will see that, yes, this is now the new main prophet. Anyway, Elisha was Elijah's disciple. His ministry was during the reigns of Jehoram, Jehu, Jeroboam II, and Jehoash. Some of the highlights were when he multiplied the oil for the widow so she could pay her debts. This is the one that had given him some food and such. He raised the son of a Shumanite woman from the dead. He revealed the plans of the Syrian king to the king of Israel so that they would be able to respond. And he also pronounced the end of the Assyrian siege. We get now to the prophet Jonah. He ministers during the reign of King Jeroboam II. He was a contemporary of Amos. You might also notice that he was mentioned in 2 Kings 14:25. And he's the only prophet that was specifically sent to a foreign land to warn them about being evil and not following God, and to try to get them to come back and to come into the fold of God. He was sent to Nineveh. Might have heard this place. In fact, during the Iraq wars, you might have heard about it, because one of the Saddam's divisions was called the Nineveh division. He was trying to bring back the glory of the Assyrian Empire. So he was naming a lot of his divisions after things about that. But Nineveh was in what would be now Iraq. Now, Assyria was Israel's enemy, and eventually it was who God was going to use to bring judgment on this northern kingdom. But at the moment, God is sending a prophet to Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, to bring his word to them. Now, Jonah didn't want to go, mostly because he was afraid that they would repent and God wouldn't destroy them. And since they were Israel's enemy, he really didn't want that to happen. So, of course, the whole story about him running away. And one of the things we notice here, too, is that, when you don't do what God has called you to do, that other people can suffer, too. Jonah ran away. He got on this ship trying to go as far the opposite direction as he could go from Nineveh. The big storm came up, and the people on the ship were in jeopardy. They thought they were going to die. And until they managed to find out that the reason was because God was trying to get Jonah's attention to get him to go back to where he was supposed to go, and threw Jonah overboard. And then things calmed down, and the people were no longer in jeopardy. But just something to keep in mind as we're looking at, when we're trying to figure out what God's calling us to do, and maybe we don't want to do it because of might be something that we're afraid that something will happen that we don't want to happen, like somebody that maybe we've been called to approach and give a message to, and maybe there's somebody we haven't really been fond of. Maybe we're afraid that they will respond, and we were kind of secretly hoping that something nasty would happen to them, which is not good, but part of our nature sometimes does that. But other people can be hurt in the process when we don't follow what we're supposed to do. And of course, when Jonah finally did go to Nineveh and preach the word, that there was a revival. The king was in sackcloth and ashes, and he told everybody, yes, the Lord, God of Israel is the God. And of course, this made Jonah even less happy about the whole thing, because darn, he said, this is exactly what I was afraid was going to happen. But what we see here is a demonstration of God's sovereignty over everything. We see his sovereignty over the wind and the waves, the storm, the fact that he could bring a big fish up and transport Jonah after 3 days of time to contemplate of maybe he should be going and doing what God told him to do, and then have him spit out onto dry land so he could continue. And it's also a demonstration of God's desire to save all, not just the selected few of Israel. And in fact, this incident was then quoted later in the New Testament as the evidence that, yes, the disciples should go out and include the Gentiles in their ministry. And another prophet that we're going to look at is Amos. The interesting thing here, also during our high-level overview, we talked about how the prophets weren't all from the priestly ranks. And Amos is a good example. He was a sheep herder prior to his call to become a prophet. He also ministers during the reign of Jeroboam II. He pronounces the coming judgment on Israel and Judah after, of course, he had prophesied against all the surrounding nations. He issues God's call to return to him, and he intercedes in a case or two on behalf of the people. He prophesies the day of the Lord will come, and he delivers God's promise that Israel will be restored after the judgment, and a remnant will return. Now here we see another case of a little bit difference in the methods. Here Amos is being given all these insights through visions. We don't see that so much in the others that we've seen to this point. But here's another case of differing methods that are being used and to deliver the message to the prophets, and for the prophets to deliver the message to the people. So here Amos goes about telling the people about these visions that he has been given from God for these various nations, the surrounding nations, and for Israel and Judah. And finally, we see that as we noted, every one of the kings did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And despite the warning from God's prophets, Israel really never gave up their idol worship. In fact, it got worse and worse. So in 722 BC, Israel was carried away into captivity in Assyria. And when we say carried away, they actually were relocated, because Assyria's methodology at that time when they would conquer an area was that they would take the people from that area, resettle them somewhere else, and then bring people from one of their other conquered areas and move them into the area that they had just conquered, just to avoid possible rising up and etc. Just people are not in their familiar places. They're not likely to rise up as much because they're not in their traditional homeland. So from this we can see that disobedience does bring judgment. We also see that God's going to warn people before implementing the judgment. All these prophets at this point were warning people, saying, hey, you're not following the Lord, and there are going to be consequences. But the people would ignore it. But the message was consistent throughout the history of the divided kingdom. It's always a consistent message. You're not doing what you're doing, but if you return to me, then things will be good. If not, there will be judgment. So, next week, we'll be looking at the kingdom of Judah and see what goes on there with the kings, the prophets, and their eventual being carted off into captivity. See you next week.